It is Friday, August 7, 2026, coming to you from America's beautiful North Coast, from the shores of Lake Superior. This is the American Descent. Before we dive in, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, leave a comment. It all helps as we begin our journey here on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast, please leave a 5-star review. Thank you ever so much. On today's show, we'll be playing an interview Jen and I did with J.P. Gresh about the war in Ukraine back in early July. J.P. Gresh is a recently retired colonel with the United States Army. He spent his Army career strengthening U.S. security via allies and partners, representing our country in some of the toughest spots: Ukraine, Russia, and in the Middle East. He is a non-resident fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and serves on the board of Duluth Sister Cities in Duluth, Minnesota. Before we turn to that interview, though, I need to address an error I made in yesterday's episode. It was an error Jen corrected me on immediately at the time, but reporting has come out that helps make more sense of why it was so easy to make the mistake. In our interview with Duke Skorich and Patty McNulty, we briefly discussed the Democratic primary in Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District, which is the seat being vacated by Angie Craig since she's running for this open Senate seat. The primary has come down to what is effectively a three-way race between the DFL-nominated candidate Matt Little, Matt Klein, and Caleb Berg. They are all state-level legislators. I was mistakenly under the impression that Caleb Berg had staked out a position to the left of Matt Little. It turns out, according to reporting by Julian Andrioni and Ryan Grimm at Dropsite News, that the error I made was intended. According to their reporting, based on polls showing Little ahead of second-place Klein, with Berg at a close third, quote, "Given the numbers, the path to victory for Klein was clear. He needed Little to be brought down by boosting Berg, splitting the vote between the two progressives, and needed big money to get himself past both of them. In stepped the PACs organized to support women, which were funded by AIPAC and DMFI, the Democratic Majority for Israel." Dropsite then goes on to explain all of the complicated transfers of money to those support women PACs that originated from the PACs supporting Israel. It is true that she has not taken AIPAC money directly, but on May 13th, 4 days after Little won the DFL endorsement, DMFI transferred $500,000 to Women Vote, the independent expenditure arm of Emily's List, a pro-choice PAC. Then, less than a month later, Women Vote spent $584,448 in independent expenditures supporting Berg. In an interview with Ryan Grimm on his show Breaking Points, Matt Little explains what he sees as Caleb Berg's leftward evolution in position, both since he won the DFL endorsement and since this money has entered the race. In other words, Berg has only recently taken positions on the left, and it appears this is being done in a financially coordinated attempt to drag voters away from Matt Little to allow Matt Klein, a full-throated supporter of Israel backed openly by AIPAC, to sneak through the primary. I apologized for being fooled by this nonsense. I will put a link to both the Dropsite News article and the Breaking Points interview on YouTube in the description below. Now on to our early July interview with J.P. Gresh, recently retired colonel with the United States Army, who spent his Army career strengthening U.S. security via allies and partners, representing the U.S. in Ukraine, Russia, and in the Middle East. He is a non-resident fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. JP, welcome to the show.
Sam, great to be here.
All right. Well, I mean, we can dive right into the deep end. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about Iran, but there's also a lot of stuff been going on lately back and forth between Russia and Ukraine. And I know that you've spent time in both countries in your life. So you're the expert here on what's going on with these countries. And of course, it's mostly, it's a full-on conflict. It's a war. And things have changed a lot since 4-5 years. God, it's been a while now since this has been going on. Things have changed a lot from the initial, everybody thought Russia would just roll over Ukraine. That didn't happen. And now it's just kind of been this slow rolling thing with drones and missiles. So why don't you kind of set the scene for where we are today and what's going on now? I mean, Ukraine has been bombing Russian oil sites, and Russia has been sending missiles and drones and hitting civilian targets in Ukraine lately. So what's kind of the state of play right now?
Oh, thanks for the question, Sam. It's indeed the war over Ukraine has been going on upwards. We're on our 5th year now, almost. In fact, the war, just to set the stage, has been going on for longer than the duration of World War II. And it has claimed the lives of far greater numbers of casualties than we've seen in recent history. It's the greatest in terms of casualties, state-on-state conflict that we've seen in the last at least 10 years, for sure, excluding our own experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so you're right. We've seen a lot of evolution, I think, of warfare in this time frame, from the onset of the Russia initial invasion on February 24th, 2022, to present day. And so what I usually like to tell folks, having observed this war over the last 4 years, and being actually, in fact, I was in Moscow when Russia launched their invasion, their subsequent invasion, their second invasion, as we like to call it, or the full-scale invasion.
Wow.
In 2022. But there's a couple different conflicts, I think you can sort of categorize or help sort of make sense of the war today in a couple different ways. One, we've seen this back and forth maneuver warfare in the onset when Russia did attempt this sort of blitzkrieg-like notion to take Kyiv in the initial days. And that was all, of course, thwarted by Ukrainian territorial forces and Ukrainian armed forces quite adeptly, notably with the prevention of seizing an airfield that was close to Kyiv, which was probably the pivotal moment in those initial days of the war. And then, of course, you saw throughout 2022, Ukrainians gradually pushing back and reclaiming territory throughout that time frame, essentially exposing weaknesses in the Russian line during that time. And then onset to 2023, everyone was following the counteroffensive that was supported by the United States and other allies, which ultimately did not pan out for many reasons. And then to present day 2024, and then for the last 2 years, what we've seen is essentially attritional warfare along the line of contact from Kharkiv up in the north all the way down along that elbow north of Crimea. And that line has remained fairly static over the last year. But in the last 30 days, we've seen some progress by Ukrainian forces to regain more land than they have lost. And in fact, the tide appears to be gradually turning in Ukrainians' favor, if we're talking about strict territorial gain and loss. Now, it's still a brutal conflict, and both sides are losing a lot of men on the front. Ukraine is losing less, but per capita probably more as a percentage of the population, since it's just a smaller state than Russia. Right. Russia has lost probably upwards of 1.2 million casualties. That's both killed in action and wounded in action. And meanwhile, Ukraine, while it suffers other casualties as well, it suffers less because it is on the defense, and it's easier always to defend than to attack. And the Russian armed forces for a long period of history have relied on manpower to support their means of attack. And we've seen this cycle repeat itself over history again and again. So on the front, basically attritional warfare. And then, of course, there's an indirect fight, as we say, in the air with drones, ballistic missiles, and other indirect fire weapons basically being launched on population centers, infrastructure on both sides. And of course, Russia started this several years ago by bombing what they thought were essentially military targets or hard infrastructure. About 2 years ago, they really intensified their campaign on energy infrastructure, really hitting the Ukrainians, notably in the wintertime, destroying a lot of those heating plants and a lot of the electrical substations, which put Kyiv and other population centers in large amounts of darkness throughout the winter. This was a Russian strategy to sort of help, in their mind, force Ukrainians to quit. And in fact, it had the opposite effect. Most Ukrainians are more resilient than ever in resisting these attacks. So Ukrainians have responded, like you said in the initial comments, by launching their own drone attacks against energy infrastructure in Russia. And this has had a pretty powerful impact. In fact, President Putin just the other day admitted to dipping into oil reserves and helping shore up those shortages, notably for the agricultural sector, to make sure that Russia is still bringing in profit and bringing in revenue for the state. And so it's a startling admission by a fairly powerful regional player to admit that they are running short on oil. So we'll see how this plays out. This is part of the Ukraine strategy to help get Russia to tire of the conflict and to help bring the war back to Moscow and bring the war back to Russians so that they feel it at home.
Right. But I mean, you mentioned that Ukraine has started to, at least in territory, turn the tide. How likely is that to result in any in serious gains for Ukraine, considering how, as you said, attritional, I'll use your word, how attritional it has been for now 3 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think essentially the Ukrainian strategy is not so much to, while they acknowledge they need to get their land back, the military strategy does not rely on a necessity for maneuver to regain land along the line of contact. So what I'm saying is essentially, as long as they prevent further incursions by the Russian armed forces, they are essentially winning. And so their commander-in-chief, General Syrskyi, has admittedly in fact, admitted as much in recent interviews that the military strategy relies on bleeding Russian oil reserves, which supply the front, which make Russia money on the global market, preventing further incursions along the line of contact, and then just showing the world that Ukraine is still there and showing that Ukraine is worth the support, especially among its European partners, so they can continue to supply Ukraine with needed critical sort of exquisite systems to help shore up air defenses and the like.
Right. And meanwhile, Russian demands are essentially exactly the same today as they were years ago, which is we want the 4 provinces that we've taken just handed over, so territory handed over, and we want Ukraine to withdraw its attempt to enter NATO. Those are the demands of Russia, and they continue to be. I mean, Putin is not budging, and of course, Ukraine, as I understand it, is not budging. We want all of our sovereignty back. We want the land back and the people back to where they were living before. That's quite an impasse. Meanwhile, as there is conflict and as energy infrastructure is bombed, civilians are harmed by all this on both sides. War is horrible for everybody involved, obviously. I mean, so it just seems like with this impasse, what can really break? Because civilians on both sides are suffering, and Putin, doesn't seem to care. And Zelensky has Yeah, sorry.
This war could go on for a very long time. So
I guess that's what I'm asking.
How do you see this ending, JP? And what are other countries, other European countries? It sounds like they've been stepping up to help Ukraine because the U.S. has not stepped up as much as we could. So what do you see as how does this end, and what are the other countries doing to help end this war?
Yeah, there's a lot of white space, as we say. There's a huge gap between war aims of Russia and Ukrainian demands and Ukrainian insistence on maintaining its territorial integrity, and with understanding, of course. So, given this huge gap, really, this war of attrition, as like all wars of attrition, usually boil down to who breaks first. It's not so much who is victorious on the tactical battlefield along the line of contact, but who tires of the war first. And right now, that's very much the strategy of the Ukrainian armed forces, to help Russia tire of the war first. Now, it's a gamble because Russia does have large stocks of, unfortunately, men who are willing to go off and fight. Because, let's be frank, there's a vast manpower resource in the Russian Federation of young men who are willing to go off and to make more money and make back home. So,
sorry, JP, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it true that I read somewhere that the Russian military is larger now than it was before the war? The people enlisted, like the actual manpower, is larger.
Maybe I haven't followed the exact numbers of the Russian army recently, but I would not be surprised. There's still a large manpower resource to draw from. But really, I think the Ukrainian strategy is to help those in power around Putin feel the impact of the war. And we've seen even polls, which are always suspect inside the Russian Federation in the first place, but even the polling inside Russia, controlled by government sources, seem to indicate much more passive support to the war than previous. The Russian, there's no unfortunately, no freedom of speech, of course, inside Russia, but you can read between the lines and compare polling today to then what it was just 2 years ago, and there's much less support for the war, and especially when senior politicians start speaking up about different alternatives, or start speaking in code about different alternatives. Then it's easy to see that there is some fatigue starting to set in. I would not say it's going to end tomorrow, but there is notably some fatigue. And having lived there myself, even during the first part of the war, I would be very surprised if there's a groundswell of patriotic fervor to support continuing this war for an indeterminate time. So, hopefully that answers your question. Maybe there's another part. I think, Jen, you asked about European countries. So it's a great question in terms of what kind or what scale and what what's the scope of their support. So it really depends on the capability. Usually NATO and European countries that make up NATO really relied on the United States for what we say enablers and logistics and intelligence support. And so those critical functions that we would provide, the network to sort of stitch everything together, to help those battlefield systems communicate with each other, the intelligence support coming from satellites that we provide, the strategic lift, meaning the large cargo aircraft that we have in our arsenal to help move munitions, to help move people. These are the kind of capabilities that the United States was very good at providing, and these are the same capabilities that we are starting, at least signaling that we will reduce in Europe and or flex to different parts of the globe, and expect a European commensurate increase in capabilities. But of course, those capabilities just aren't generated overnight. But on the good news is that there are certain European countries like Germany who have started to ramp up production of armored vehicles. Not saying that's the right capability at this moment, but it's still a good step in the right direction. There are other countries, France as well, have started to be a little bit more assertive, talking about increasing their defense capabilities as well. I have not seen discrete investments in intelligence support or satellites, but the Europeans are starting to talk about this. And the Europeans, I think, have reached a point where, given our administration's priorities and given the president's very outspoken rhetoric on Europe, I think, in a way, it could be a blessing in disguise for Europe in a way to help bolster their own defenses and to be a forcing function also to help Ukraine as well develop its own capabilities. And I would say, as a final note, we've done a lot of good things in building up Ukrainian defense and defensive capabilities. I was at the Pentagon when we did this under the Biden administration, where we provided billions of dollars of assistance at Ukrainian request, and Ukrainians took that assistance and made very good use of it. And they were, I think, quite adept at making lemons in a way. Not saying our assistance was lemons, but we gave them a lot of different types of capabilities, and they were able to fuse that into an effective capability at the front. And as we like to say, of course, necessity is the mother of invention. Ukrainians have actually proven quite adept at showing others around the globe what modern warfare could look like a couple years out, with the massive, scale up of drone production and other autonomous systems.
Right. And that's something we've seen already in Iran, the use of drones and all those kind of things, and how those change the battlefield and change the equations for people.
And in fact, Ukrainian defense industries, in the opening weeks, days of the war in Iran, were in the Middle East, selling their technology to states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE, these anti-drone capabilities that the Ukrainians have developed over 4 years of war.
Okay.
Are there private companies from the U.S. or other countries selling drone technology to Ukraine?
There are. I wouldn't be able to name them off the top of my head. I know of a couple that are there, but to be, I think, quite frank about this, I think, it's the other way around. The Ukrainian companies have the know-how. They're looking for, I think, quite frankly, the capital from Western markets to invest and scale appropriately. So I've seen this dynamic, at least in my conversations in DC and other forums that I've attended back in DC, in terms of bringing together U.S. investment with Ukrainian know-how.
And on that very line, what was notable, and again going back to Iran, what was notable was their use of these very inexpensive drones. Whereas when we think about drones in terms of United States armed services, these are the very high-tech, extremely expensive drones. So I'm assuming that Ukraine is leaning more towards what Iran is doing, being able to produce large numbers of these much more inexpensive drones that have wide use. They may be a little bit more blunt as objects, as it were, but you can produce so many more of them and create all kinds of different havoc in any given strategic situation. Is that fair to say?
Very fair to say. In fact, over the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, our drone capabilities were focused on reconnaissance and long-range surgical strikes into what we say high-value targets. So, for instance, even the raid on Osama bin Laden's his compound relied on this kind of usage of drones. Drones that sit way at high altitude, that can see down and pinpoint, and then send that targeting info to another shooter, whether or not it possesses the capability itself to make an impact on the battlefield. And so that was really essentially the way the United States used drones for over 10 years. What we're seeing in Ukraine was a technology where a vast proliferation of off-the-shelf technology, basically,
Right.
these commercial off-the-shelf drones, basically quadcopters that they would then retrofit, put more powerful engines on so that it could support a payload, and then fly that quadcopter basically into a Russian armored vehicle, and then see what the effects were, and then wash, rinse, repeat. Okay, so this evolution of of trial by error, over 4 years has yielded tremendous impacts in terms of destruction along the front. Where a couple years ago, I remember officials kind of bewildered at the prospect of Ukrainians being able to make 1 million drones in 1 year. And now we're already hearing numbers that Ukrainians are making 5 to 7 million drones per year, and Russia doing the same. So it's a huge exponential, capability in terms of this drone warfare. From a technical sort of military wonky term, we call these first person view drones. And so FPV, or one way attack drones, where they're essentially just, used, and, they're disposable drones and
Right.
flown into the enemy, sometimes with a warhead of varying sizes, depending on the target. And it's not just this drone that I think is notable along the battlefield, along the line of contact. It's it's pairing with a whole suite of sensors along the line of contact that can detect movement in this 30-kilometer belt that separates forces, the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces. So what we have is a huge number of different sensors that can pick up acoustic and other heat signatures in that space, where if anything of size moves, then it's immediately connected via this network to what we say the shooter, which could be an artillery piece, a traditional old cannon artillery that could
Right.
pinpoint and destroy that target, or a drone that's in close proximity that will fly right into that target. And so what we have, the effect on the battlefield, is less mass, as we say in military terms, and more precision. It's not even precision, but like a smaller footprint, smaller movements of dismounted infantry, creeping into the lines and avoid detection to try to make gains on the battlefield. And so this is partly why you see this attritional state of affairs, where nothing can move of significance along the line of contact because everything is seen. This lends itself to what a lot of defense experts are calling the transparent battlefield, where a lot of military theorists and a lot of military observers are now trying to scratch their head and figure out how to restore maneuver, which has been relied on, going back to since the beginning, or since the end of World War I, to ensure that there are gains on the battlefield to retake territory. And so the absence of maneuver means the absence of like large scale offensives and the regaining of territory for both sides.
If there
Right,
is
man.
if there is a stalemate, like the Western Front, like no one, Ukraine, Russia, they're not making any progress on reclaiming territory. Can you see a country coming in to help broker a peace agreement? And is that in any way, would that happen during the Trump administration, or will it take the next administration? Will it take, flipping the House and the Senate in the US and a new president who's more pro-Ukraine? Or is there some hope that Trump gets sick of it and can compromise a deal with Putin? I don't know what that will look like. He would probably be more pro-Russia, which they've been in the past, and that might be a bad thing for Ukraine, may not want anything to do with that. Is there another country, leaders in other countries, that can get together, and would even Putin come to the table to broker a deal?
And who has credibility?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
what would do you know what the compromise would look like? Because I think people are really, especially in Ukraine, are tired of living under the uncertainty that they or their loved ones could die. And I don't know if it matters what the public of Russia thinks. They probably can't sway Putin to change his military tactics. He seems like he's going to be more dug in and may disregard what the public thinks.
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. I think in terms of whether the United States is in a position to do this at this point, I think I'm very skeptical of its ability to broker any deal right now. I think there's been a considerable loss of trust between Ukraine and U.S. policymakers, and just in general between the governments themselves, just because of the actions of the Trump administration over the past 2 years. You can point fingers at a couple different factors that led to that, of course. But here we are, and I don't think Ukraine is willing to see the U.S. as a broker anymore because of that loss of faith. I also don't think the current administration has the patience to go back to looking at this in any sustained, credible way. I could be wrong, but we've seen just a fluctuation of interests in global interests over in 2026 alone, spreading from Latin America to Iran. So it's really hard, I think, for the National Security Council, the enterprise that makes up these sort of serious, sustained negotiations. I don't see that fabric in our administration right now willing to devote time and patience and resources to that, quite frankly. So it could require a new administration. In terms of new countries or other countries that could do this, we've seen, we've been doubtful of European commitment before, but like I said in my opening comments, I think Europeans are looking at this with a fresh set of eyes. There are factions within the European Union and NATO that are more hawkish on this than others. Notably, Scandinavian countries and Eastern European countries are quite, they are really pushing the policy, I think, inside the EU at least, to do more on this conflict. And I wouldn't rule out factions within NATO doing more, stepping up, or just a bilateral effort on either France or Germany's part to try to broker a deal. Now, whether or not Putin respects that, maybe. Maybe. It depends, I think, on how much pain has been inflicted on the Russian Federation at that juncture.
But, if Putin knows America's not going to do anything, or that during the Trump administration, is he going to capitalize on that and use this time while Trump is president to do more, to invade other countries potentially? Is this his opportunity to build his empire?
I think there's always a mismatch between Russian appetite and capabilities. They've miscalculated on Ukraine. They're losing influence in the Caucasus. They are losing influence in Central Asia. This is very much a regional power on the decline. Its former Soviet sphere of influence is no longer what it was in 1992. So I don't think, that being said, it's an extremely irrational geopolitical player, as we saw in 2022. I was one actually in 2021 when we started to see the indications of this buildup along the Ukrainian border. It took even me a while to believe that Russia would embark on a second invasion of Ukraine while already possessed large amounts of territory in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. It's not a rational actor, and Putin has seen or has behaved in a way that is quite irrational, at least to us, in trying to restore his grandeur of a restored Soviet empire. But even
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it seems like he's thinking more in terms of like czarist ambitions even than Soviet ones. I mean, it seems very more empire based I mean, perhaps from that lens, it makes a little bit of sense. I mean, he sees it used to be the Ukraine, right? Not Ukraine as a country. It was the borderlands for Russia.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to get into a treatise on the the viability of the Ukrainian, Ukrainian nationhood. I mean, obviously,
Well, no, I'm not
Ukraine.
asking. I'm just saying.
Yeah,
I'm just saying that from a czarist perspective, or from
of
that
course, no, of
perspective
course.
of empire, it may be. I'm not saying Putin makes sense, but in that framing, perhaps we can understand where his head is at.
No, absolutely.
Perhaps.
No, I mean, we've come to see. I mean, the gloves are off, right? And so we've come to see over the last 5 years a sort of like no holds barred, and how Putin thinks for the most part. We understand. He says what he wants. It's not a mystery. No one has to decipher, I think, or read between the lines of what Russia wants right now. But even that, my point is, even that has its limits. And the Russian military performance on the battlefield alone should be an indication to how much they can possibly do in the future. And I would say also the capabilities on the flip side in the Baltics and Sweden and Finland, which are now new NATO members,
Right.
that is very much a huge military impediment to Russia's aims in those areas. And if we talk about, Russian ways of, maybe advancing on the military, at least advancing on Europe, I don't think it's so much a matter of a particular country that Russia is aiming for. Russia is always aiming to delegitimize the unity of NATO. So he may be able to do that through means other than military means. And sowing divisions, either politically or in the information space, has always been actually more of a strength for Russia than in military terms alone. So on that note, like the recent sort of political elections in Hungary are a huge step in Europe's favor to help shore up some of those seams in European unity vis-a-vis Ukraine.
For sure. And for people who aren't aware, Hungary just for the first time in over a decade got rid of their very Putin-aligned right-wing president in favor
Viktor
of
Orban.
Viktor Orban, in favor of someone who used to be in Viktor Orban's party, but has since essentially positioned himself as significantly more moderate, to the point where he's gotten out of a lot of the agreements that Orban had been a part of, and even has agreed with Europe to sanction Israel. I mean, which Viktor Orban was never considering doing. And as far as Putin's ability to feel like he can continue doing this, there was something in relation to the Iran war. When the Strait of Hormuz first closed, the U.S. Treasury Department allowed Russia to sell some of its oil on the larger global market in order to get more oil into the world. So not only are Trump's sights set elsewhere, what he's doing elsewhere is actually giving Russia an economic boost, or at least it did for that period where they were allowed to sell their oil where the sanctions were lifted conditionally for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, the sanctions were lifted for at least 30 days, maybe more. I'm not sure if those sanctions are still lifted on certain exports of Russian oil. I wouldn't be surprised if they were still lifted. So yeah, it was a huge windfall for the Russian economy. It came at a time, no better time, because it needed that revenue to help shore up some losses on the battlefield. So yeah,
right.
It shows you also just, of course, the priority of the administration at that time in terms of both, I think, reducing domestic pressure on oil prices,
Right.
but also just prioritizing, I think, the objectives, whatever they were, be it ill-defined that they were, in Iran.
Right.
And I would go back, Sam, on your question about, or actually, Jen, I think you had this question about, what's to prevent Russia from going into another European country vis-a-vis Ukraine, or much akin to what it did in the Ukraine. I think the Russians vastly overestimated their capabilities via Ukraine. We've seen that now. But they also greatly, not only vastly overestimated its own capability, but grossly underestimated Ukrainians' resilience and Ukrainians' capability of fighting back. I remember talking to everyday Russians and also fairly affluent, influential Russians inside Moscow in the days leading up to the invasion, and having these conversations where they were adamant that the Ukrainian armed forces was no better than what they encountered in 2014. And so this was a span of 8 years from the initial annexation of Crimea and the insurgency and the war that they fueled in Donbass the first time around, where legitimately Ukrainian armed forces were ill prepared to deal with that sort of threat. I had been in Ukraine during that time frame and seen the Ukrainian army. It was a shell of itself. And to see the progress also, but what I knew also was to see the progress of the Ukrainian army and the steps that they had taken in the intervening time period from 2014 to 2022. My point is that Russia still had this perception of a very weakened Ukrainian army that they would be able to roll right over. Russia probably does not have that impression of NATO forces, Swedish forces, Finnish forces, Polish forces. So it'd be a completely different, I think, risk calculus that they would have to make in order to do that against a NATO member.
Do you think part of that was not taking Zelensky seriously initially, since he had been a comedian and television guy? Was that part of the calculation, do you think?
Perhaps. Perhaps that was part of it. I think he didn't respect him. So I think there was a personality, a personal relationship that sort of influenced his decision as well. But I think moreover, I mean, he, like I said before, he published an account of the illegitimacy of Ukrainian statehood in the summer of 21, saying that Ukraine was a false state. Basically, it was a creation of the Soviet Union. And I think he really believed that. And so I think that sort of impression of this artificial Ukrainian state helped influence his decision to nullify it and to absorb it within the greater Russian world.
Man, considering, what's happened to Ukraine over the course of the 20th century, I'm thinking of the Holodomor and in between the wars. And I mean, it's just, they've gone through so much and to continue to. I mean, it's rough. And then, and Jen was talking, yeah, clearly. But I mean, they're tiring too. I mean, this is rough for everybody. And just to go back to Jen was talking about, the U.S., what has the U.S. done lately? Well, Hegseth was in Europe not so long ago, and he made a stop in Brussels, NATO headquarters in Brussels, where he, very much like when J.D. Vance was in Europe at the beginning of the presidency in February, and he was very dismissive of Europeans and he quite rude. Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, he calls himself the Secretary of War. It's a whole nother thing. Also, sadly for me at least, I have a Minnesota on my hat here. He's a fellow Minnesotan. So sorry about that world. But anyways, he made a stop in Brussels and did what J.D. Vance did. He was very insulting to Europeans. He said, shame on you for allowing so many immigrants in, and you got to get your own house in order. Dismissive of the fact that a lot of European countries have elected right-wingers in recent years, but never mind that. And he basically said he didn't want to help. Basically, he said he's not interested in helping Ukraine. That's not our thing until Europeans spend as much money basically on military expenditures as he would like personally. Pete Hegseth, he's not interested in helping Ukraine. And then he left. Zelensky was scheduled to appear in Brussels right after Hegseth, and Hegseth exited and left before Zelensky appeared. So, I mean, it appears clear where current, what the current U.S. position is on Ukraine, which is there isn't one. They're not interested.
Well, their position on Ukraine is that it's a European problem.
Right.
That is the administration's position on the Ukraine war, and you can read it in the National Defense Strategy that was released recently. It's very cut and dry. Now, that being said, there's a lot of things in the National Defense Strategy that were said and are not being followed as well, such as the war in Iran, because the NDS professes to sort of help retract U.S. presence or involvement in the Middle East. So, there's one thing about what's written and another thing what's being practiced. Now, I think in terms of like what Hegseth said in public in Brussels, I don't have the exact words here in front of me. I'm sure I saw the press snippets and the highlights, and I would just say that the secretary is very, in his public pronouncements, he's playing to he only has one person he's playing to. He's only an audience of one.
Right.
So
Yep.
A lot of these similar sort of insistence on Europeans stepping up more defense expenditures and doing more. This is not new. This has been the administration after, this has been a bipartisan issue for many years. It's just a matter of like the tone in which it is conveyed to our European allies. And a lot of times these conversations are just quite frankly held behind closed doors, one-on-one. This administration chooses to do it another way. And Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth likes to make those big pronouncements because I think he knows only one person, his audience, and his audience is of one person, and that's the person sitting back in the White House.
Right, and they both have a television background, so.
Yep. But I mean, that being said, Europeans factually have committed to a 5% of GDP in defense expenditures. At least 3.5% of that is dedicated towards hard defense investments, procurement, equipment, readiness. Another 1.5 has been termed more sustainment, other operational reserve or other support to NATO initiatives. So such as like just in Germany's case, the interior lines of the railroads and all the other logistical bases that Germany provides just by its geography is also part and parcel of NATO defense as well.
Right. Well, and NATO had
Europeans are stepping up.
Right. Well, and Europeans had additional urgent reasons to, considering this administration began with threats to, Denmark, threats to Greenland, and concerns that they would actually have to take a defensive posture with respect to the United States.
But it is so short-sighted, and for the U.S. to become more isolationist and not care about helping protect democracies in other countries. And we give up so much of our power and our influence and by withdrawing. And that's going to have real big economic repercussions, possibly. And like China stepping into that role in some ways. And I could see, I could see this down the road having, and we potentially could lose our military bases in Europe, right? If they become less reliant on the U.S. and not wanting to rely on the U.S. or our military at those bases to protect that country. So I don't know. It's very hard to explain what the Trump administration does and why, but I'm sure one person is happy about that, and that is Putin. And maybe that's really why that's happening.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly I would say Putin is very happy about that, but I think also it's less predictable for him at the moment. And I think even Russia is having questions about where it sits in Europe and starting to question, I think, how much influence it can exert through military means alone, because that's really its most formidable sort of tool, foreign policy tool at its disposal. It's its military might. It is being bogged down by the non-NATO, arguably at the outset of the war, third-rate military, which is now the most powerful military in Europe.
Right.
A country a fraction of its size.
Amazing.
So,
Amazing.
so I'm sure there's a estimation in Putin's mind of what it can achieve through military means alone. But I agree, it's completely short-sighted. I don't know what this administration is thinking on a daily basis, and I think everyone is making some credible guesses. But I think, unfortunately, the administration sees this as sort of a black and white or zero-sum game where if we were to support somebody else, what are we getting in return? This sort of transactional approach that doesn't work well or has not really aligned with our worldview for the last 80 years. So perhaps that worldview is changing, and perhaps our foreign policy is changing, not for the better, but it is changing. And I think even with a new administration in 2 years' time, I think we will probably see more restraint from the United States in world affairs. I think
we have to, right?
Yeah, and I think in some terms, I mean that's a good thing, that we see more restraint of or less interventionism through military means alone in other parts of the globe, for many reasons. For the one, in the serious reevaluation of what we can achieve through our military, as we've seen in Iran, and two, I think the American appetite for interventionism abroad. So this administration is learning it one way. It could prove to be useful for future administrations as well. So,
well, let me add, just jumping off Jen's question of what you just said about military force projection around the world. If America does reduce its military presence and its bases in Europe, I mean, outside of whatever the benefits may be for American force projection, which I'm not necessarily convinced that it's all positive and, good. What are, like, how negative is it if we do shut down some bases in Europe from the standpoint of just regular Americans going about their day and living their lives? I mean, Jen mentioned there could be some economic consequences, and we'll have a longer conversation about that. But from your perspective, just looking with that kind of international lens where perhaps there's a different world coming where America has far less force projection in the world, are there strong negatives to reducing our military presence in Europe specifically and even elsewhere around the world?
I think it depends on how it's done, right? Like, so we've seen, we've made these changes since 1991. We've reduced our force presence over time. At one point in the 80s, we had 500,000 American service members in West Germany alone, or somewhere thereabouts. I was a kid.
Amazing.
My dad was in the military in West Germany. I remember large-scale maneuver exercises that my father would participate in, trained for that Soviet threat coming through the Fulda Gap. But we've decreased our presence. The peace dividend had an effect on the decrease of American forces in the early 90s. The Clinton administration enacted a big downsizing of our military during that time frame. We saw a readjustment, a recalibration of American force presence since the global war on terror, through our wars in Iraq and our war in Afghanistan. So we've seen those changes before, but I think in the past, unlike today, it was out of necessity. It was out with a genuine conversation with European officials about having to recalibrate, to adjust, to see commensurate investment by Europeans to step up, and to ensure that there were no security gaps when we did it. Correct? So when we decreased in the past, there was not an imminent Russian threat on the doorstep of Europe. So now to do it, different optics, words matter, and the way and the tone that's done, I think, will have negative effects for sure. just more broadly on the relationship between the United States and these allies. And absolutely will have negative, I think, financial effects, have negative economic effects, and just unfortunately a decrease in trust, I think, between allies and ourselves, which is unfortunate. We're seeing, unfortunately, a new kind of American foreign policy, and I think it remains to be seen how durable this remains with the new administration, or in 2 years' time.
Yeah, well, it's a world also dealing with the fact that the Americans can elect an Obama, then elect a Trump, then elect a Biden, then elect a Trump. I mean, it doesn't seem to matter. I mean, how can Europeans take anything seriously when 4 years later it might be another massive swing, like huge swing that they cannot predict or cannot account for? So
yeah, I think it's a great point, Sam. I think the unreliability or sort of the inconsistency of American foreign policy is causing, I think, probably some Europeans to grow a little bit exacerbated and impatient, or to question the consistency of our commitment, and to look elsewhere, or at least look inwards among themselves to help shore up the problems that they have at home. So,
right.
In a way, again, that could be a good thing for Europe, but I think it's a bad thing for America.
Right. And now there's a lot more that can be said about Iran. And then on the home front, more that Pete Hegseth has done with the Pentagon and with decisions that have been made and all those kind of things. But we can definitely, we're going to have to save that for another conversation and another time. This was a fantastic conversation. I know speaking for myself, I learned an absolute ton. It's been a great to have you on, JP. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. And I think we've just touched the tip of the iceberg of what we could talk about.